Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, fellow young farmers. I'm Rosie Bennett, Vice Chairman of Devon Young Farmers, and in my professional life, I'm a Chartered Certified Accountant. I'd like to welcome you to Devon Young Farmers and NFU Mutual's webinar on the topic of succession planning, starting the conversation. Tonight we have three really qualified speakers: Professor Matt Lobley from Exeter University, Sean McCann from NFU Mutual, and our very own County Chairman, Matt Darke. They will be talking about all things succession. After we've heard all our speakers speak tonight, there will be an opportunity for you as the audience to ask some questions and our speakers answer. So throughout the evening, if you pop a question in the chat box as you go along, I will collate them and direct them to the appropriate speaker. Now, our first speaker tonight is Professor Matt Lobley. He's a Professor of Rural Resource Management and a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Exeter. He has 30 years of experience researching and interviewing farming families across the UK. Matt is also a co-director of Farm Transfers, an international project examining the pattern and process of farm succession and retirement. Over to you, Matt.
Great, thanks. Just put my camera back on. Right, hello everyone. So I really want to give a kind of overview of some of the issues around farm succession planning. So we are going to talk about how you start off some of these conversations and how difficult some of these conversations can be, but we will go a bit further than that, look at various aspects of the process. So I'll just put this slide up just to show, I haven't just rocked up here tonight, not having done this kind of thing before. These are just some of the businesses that I've worked with on the topic of farm succession planning. And in fact, this presentation is a kind of pared down version of a presentation I used for training staff at NFU Mutual on some of the non-technical aspects of succession. So I deal with the kind of the people side of it, the human side of it. There are lots of experts, and Sean's going to come on after me and we'll talk about the financial side of things. And I've been doing this, as I said, for quite some time, interviewed many farmers and farming families about succession. What we're going to do during this presentation is dip in and out of a farming family as they try and negotiate their way through the process of succession. So I just want to introduce you to them now. So this is the Marshall family. We're going to meet the father, and we're going to meet his daughter and the chickens.
Well, there's three children. There's James. Now he's in South Africa. He is farming. And then there's my youngest lad, Robert. Now, it doesn't sound like a proper job to me, but he delivers luxury yachts all around the world. And then, of course, here at home, there's Sarah. And really, Sarah, well, of course, without her, there wouldn't be a farm.
Dad's brilliant. Dad's absolutely brilliant. And I mean, farming is completely in his blood. And I like to think I have some influence, but he does like things done his way, bless him. He's old school.
Do you think you will want to take over the farm?
Well, that would be fantastic, but, we've never really discussed it. It's not an easy one, is it, really? I've got two brothers, and at some point I'm going to have to discuss it with Dad, but it's one of those conversations you need to have, but the right time never really seems to present itself. I mean, Dave, my husband, and I, we talk about it all the time, but yeah, someday soon I'm going to have to pluck up the courage, really.
Okay, so we'll come back again in a few minutes to Sarah and her father, see how they get on. But as you've already seen, she says, she talks about succession with her husband all the time. She's never had this conversation with her father. And she says, it's easy to put off, difficult to find the right time, and that's what happens. Often when people talk about succession, they talk about things like handing over the reins or passing the baton. And it's possible I took a little bit too literally when I was starting to look for images. But then I thought, actually, you know what? This is really quite good, because here we go. These guys haven't just turned up there for a race. They've trained and practiced for thousands of hours. They'll have broken down every aspect of the race. They have a team of advisors to help them. They know exactly when to start handing over that baton, how long they're both going to be holding it at the same time, and when the guy at the back needs to let go. So they've done this over and over and over again. If you think about things you're good at, you probably got good at them by repeating them, doing it over again, practicing. The problem with farming is people don't get much experience at succession planning. So the older generation may have been involved in some of the discussions when they came into the business, and then obviously as they transition out. Well, that's twice. That's not enough for most people to get good at stuff, or to know when you need to do things, or the sequence of events. And that's part of the problem, because there's a lot of research evidence from family businesses, so not just farms, but family businesses. Many businesses are family businesses. Lots of research evidence that says if the business engages in succession planning, it's associated with improved business performance and growth. And okay, there may be a little bit of a wobble at the handover stage, but other than that, it's associated with the trajectory of growth. Businesses without succession planning are associated with decline and with failure. So if we want to grow the agricultural sector, if we want a successful agricultural sector, we need to plan for succession. That's easier said than done. It gets talked about a lot, but it's much harder to get people to actually face up to some of the issues and plan. And the problem is, if you get it wrong, right, and if you're in a race, you drop the baton, well, you know, it's very disappointing, but another race will be along soon. If you drop the family farm and get it wrong, there's not another one coming around. So it's really important to get this right. Okay, so I don't know how many times I've already said succession in this presentation, but I haven't actually said what I mean. So just a very brief, some definitions. And I think this is important, because I think one of the reasons succession planning is often seems so daunting to people is that they seem to think it involves everything, maybe all at once, handing over managerial control, handing over ownership, and the word that many farmers don't like, the R word, retirement. So I try to break things down into these different elements. So when I'm talking about succession, I'm talking about, in a farming context, the intergenerational transfer of managerial control. And this is a point I always try to get across, that ownership can stay the same, but you can be handing over managerial control. Not all at once, you know, little by little. At some point, there needs to be transfer of the ownership of land and farming assets. Typically that happens through inheritance on death of the previous owner, but there are other ways of doing it as well, and Sean will probably touch on some of that. Then there's the really tricky bit in the middle, retirement, which, you know, I've said there is withdrawal from physical labour and managerial control. It's often seen as really difficult in farming situations, because farmers don't particularly want to adopt what may be a kind of urban approach to retirement, that, you know, you come to a certain age and that's it, everything stops, you just cease all kind of working activity. Partly, and I don't need to explain this to all of you, you know, it's not just a job, it's a way of life, it's something people want to continue to do, and that's fine. Nobody's saying people have to stop farming entirely. I interviewed a few years ago, I did some work about retired farmers, and it was for the farming help charities that were trying to understand more about some of the issues farmers face going through the retirement process, and, you know, how that might help in terms of kind of policies to put in place. So I was trying to interview retired farmers. I could find loads of farmers, I could find loads of dead farmers, but trying to find retired farmers was really, really difficult. Anyway, I found a few, and I was interviewing a guy. He was 76, and he explained to me that he was waking up in hospital after his 3rd heart attack, and decided that, you know, it was probably a bit of a sign and he really should hand over the business to his son. So he handed over all the management of the business to his son. He handed over a lot of the ownership, and he retired. And then he went on to explain to me that now he was retired, he only worked 40 hours a week on the farm. Now, for him, that was retirement. He'd moved away a whole mile away from the farm, but went back home to the farm every single day. And for him, that was retirement, and that works. But the point I'm trying to say is it has to be some sort of difference to what was going on earlier. But a lot of farmers struggle with this. So it's those 3 different elements: handing over managerial control, withdrawing from running the business, and then eventually handing over ownership of the business. I just wanted to show you some data. I mean, you know, I'm an academic, so every so often I you know, look at data. We run in the Centre for Rural Policy Research periodically. We run a large survey of farmers in the southwest, and we ask all sorts of things, and sometimes we ask about succession. And the reason I put this up is because you will often hear or see in the press figures saying, you know, shock horror, only 30% of farms have a successor. You know, who's going to continue to produce our food? Where are all the farmers going to come from? And the problem with those kind of figures, which is exactly the kind of figures at the end of the graph there, is that they're a cross-section of farmers of all sorts of different ages. So when we ask this question, when we present the data, we look at it by the age of the farmer who's responding to the question. And what we typically see, and which you see here, is by the time farmers get into, you know, what in the non-farming world would be retirement age, 65 plus, large proportions of them, somewhere between 45 and 50%, have a successor. They tend to be the largest farms. That tends to account for most farmed land. There was that group there in the over 65s that said it's too early. How can it be too early to know whether you've got a successor? When I first saw that bit of information, I thought there'd been a data entry error. We went back and checked, and it wasn't. And some of those were people in their 70s, desperately hoping that maybe a grandchild would come back and take over the farm. So it's just a point to make, when you see these figures about succession rates, it's really important to look at the age profile of respondents, because of course that group of young farmers, young in the sense they're under 45, well, it's not surprising most of them don't have a successor. So succession planning, it varies for different families. I've spoken to families who they've never had any difficulties. They've managed to kind of negotiate through the process quite happily. They've not necessarily needed outside help other than when it comes to the kind of legal aspects and the tax aspects. But often it does involve difficult conversations, often tough decisions as well. But it's really important. I always say this when I'm talking to farming families. It might be difficult, but there are lots of benefits of succession and retirement planning. It helps protect the business and other family assets. It allows the successors and the older generation to plan. You know, when you know where you're going, when you know what's going to be happening, it's a lot easier to work out what you need to do when it's going to happen. Otherwise, it's just, you know, existing in uncertainty all the time. And we know, you know, at the minute we exist in a state of considerable uncertainty, and it's difficult to deal with sometimes. And it also helps minimize risks. So let's start having a look at some of these difficult conversations. We go back to Sarah and her dad.
Dad? Dave and I have been having a chat, and something I wanted to talk to you about, quite serious.
Serious? How do you mean?
Well,
You're all right?
Yes, yeah. Just that we've spent quite a lot of time talking about it, really, and
Well, come on.
well, I don't want to upset anyone, but it's a bit awkward.
Get on with it.
We wondered whether whether Mum would like us to cook Christmas dinner this year instead of her having to do it.
I thought it was really serious. Well, mind you, that is serious. From your mother's point of view, you know what she'll say.
do,
No,
exactly.
It's very nice of you, but, well, I'll talk to her. I'll see how it goes, all right?
Thanks.
So she was all set to raise the topic and then she bottled it at the end. But let's
Dad?
see, have another go.
Me and Dave have been having a chat and I wanted to talk to you about something quite serious.
How do you mean serious?
Well...
You're all right?
Yeah.
And Dave's all right?
Yeah,
and the children?
Yeah, nothing like that, Dad. It was serious to do with the farm and what's happening.
Oh, you mean about the herd?
Well,
you're right. I mean, you've brought this up before, and the way I see it, over the next couple of years, with the way the price of milk is now, you know, you're right. We just cannot keep the size of herd that we've currently got. So I did a bit of work, and I talked to the accountant people, you know, and I think I can see a way through these next 2 years. And we'll cut back a bit, as you suggested.
Okay, so they're still talking at cross purposes.
Dad, Dave and I have been having a chat and I wanted to talk to you about something quite serious.
Serious?
Yeah.
Go on.
Well, it's a bit awkward and I don't want you to be upset.
Come on, if you can't talk to me, I don't know who you can talk to.
Well, we have noticed lately that you've been finding it quite difficult keeping up with everything on the farm.
What? How do you mean?
Well,
I'm doing what I've always done.
I know that, Dad, but you're not as young as you were, Dad, are you?
What are you saying?
Well,
I'm fit as a fiddle,
you
me.
are, Dad. Don't take offence, but look, what we were wondering was whether it might help you if you wanted to hand over some of the more businessy financial side to us to look after.
I've always been really good with the money. I mean, I've not survived here all my life without being good with money, you know.
Well, I know that, Dad, but, you know, it's...
I mean, what do you think? Do you want to put me out to grass? What, is that what you want?
Okay, last time.
Dad, me and Dave have been having a chat and I need to talk to you about something quite serious. It's really awkward and I know...
Go on.
Well, there's no easy way to talk about it, really, but we sort of need to talk about what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah?
Like, you know, further down the line, whether you'd thought about anything, really, or if you've made any plans about what's going to happen after, you know, later on.
Do you mean like if I might retire or something like that?
Well, yeah, and after that as well, you know.
Well, no, I can't say as I have, really.
Because I don't... Time is sort of getting on, really, and we don't really want to we don't want to end up like the Jacksons did, you know, in that mess they ended up with after Terry went, and I'm sorry, it's so hard, Dad. Just say something, will you?
I don't know what you expect me to say.
Okay, so we'll dip in again in a few minutes and see how things progress. But you can see there, Sarah doesn't know how to introduce the topic. She's thinking about it all the time, but her father didn't know she was going to try and talk to her about that. She doesn't have the right vocabulary. She can't use words. She's talking about what might happen in the future and down the line and after. So it can be really difficult to know how to do this. And also, she's sitting around his kitchen table. Well, maybe that's not the best place to do that. So it's very difficult. There's some good examples there of how it is easily got wrong. If we could move on to the next slide. I know we're going to try and avoid saying that. And might as well just run through, there's a bit of animation here. So there's a lot of potential for conversation confusion, which is what we just saw there. People kind of talking at cross purposes. And I think it can be due to the timing of the conversation. Maybe it's the wrong time. Maybe it's at some sort of family event. Maybe it's Dad's birthday and everyone's around and having a meal and whatever. And then, somebody towards the end says, have you been thinking about the future? Well, that's a family event. That's not a business event. And the location I mentioned, sitting around the kitchen table. Yeah, I know a lot of decisions get made around that kitchen table, but actually for some of these things, it might be better to remove yourselves from, that particular space and maybe have something a bit more neutral, or maybe in a meeting room. And there's also the role. Sarah and her father there were very much in kind of father-daughter mode, but actually they needed to be in business partner mode. So there's a lot of things to think about here. If you could just click one more time, Dan. There's the vocabulary issue. So you're all probably far too young to have ever gone to a solicitor to make a will, but if you do, they'll talk in pretty plain terms. They'll say, you are going to die. You need to get your head around it and sort out what you want to happen to your things that you own. And obviously there is the potential for conflict. There's lots of potential for conflict. So one of the things about family businesses, when it all works well, everybody's kind of working together like that. But once you start getting into issues about who's going to run the business, who's going to own the business, what's going to happen to non-succeeding heirs, then, you can get this. Conflict happens. And, we see more and more in the press about, families ended up taking each other to court over disputed wills. So on the next slide, this is one of the things we advise farming families to think of, because as I said, there's so much to think of, so much to take into account. So we use this model, FOB, family ownership business. To be perfectly honest with you, it's the most useful Venn diagram I've ever come across. I didn't know Venn diagrams were that useful, but this one is. So when you say start at the beginning, think about who is family. So, family are blood relatives, partners, cousins, but how far along do you go? Do you include second cousins? Decide who is family, and then that's great. You all know your family, and you know who's who. Family size changes, people might move in and out of family. But then you think, right, okay, well, we know who the family is, but not everybody we would want having any role in the business, and not everybody would want to be involved. So think about who might be involved in ownership of the business, who's also part of the family. There may be other people that have an ownership stake who aren't necessarily part of the family. And then think about the business, actually running the business, making operational decisions. Some of those people may be family members, but they could be people outside the family. Somebody could start off in the business circle and end up being a member of the family. And then you've got that bit in the middle. I'm pointing at my screen, it doesn't really work on Zoom, where all those circles intersect. So that's somebody there, or some people who own at least part of the business, they're members of the family, and they're running it as well. And this is just a way of beginning to think about, who needs to be involved in these discussions, which different aspects do we need to think of. Okay, next slide. So one of the things that comes up a lot is what is equal and what is fair. Should you divide everything equally, or should you just give it all to one person? So here's the two examples, just to illustrate that in a relatively short period of time, right, just in the space of 4 generations, if the model that is adopted is to give everybody equal shares, by the time you get down into the 4th generation, there are people there with just over 4% shares of the business. Some people have slightly larger shares, but the smallest is 4%. Now, if you were part of the Lego family or the Heineken family or something like that, a 4% share of that business might be very nice. But if you come from a typical farming family, a 4% share is, no good to anybody. And I remember on a training course, actually, a young guy who had around about, I think his was about 7% share of his family business, and he left, and he was really angry about the way it had been done. And that stayed with him for a long time. So these are really important things to think about, because parents are going to want to be fair to their children. They also got to think about what's best for the business as well, and there's a real tension there, as we will see when we move on to the next slide and the next film clip.
So you see, Sarah, I think, as far as I can understand it, we've got the money side and all that taxation. I think we've got that sorted. I should have done it earlier, and it would have been better, but there's no use crying over that one, is there? And as far as everything else goes, well, it's what you'd expect. It's what your mother and I have always done. It's equal between the 3 of you, between James and yourself and Robert. It's an equal split 3 ways.
What? Everything?
Aye. Well, what else could we do?
Well, I don't know what to say, really, Dad. I mean, well, if I'm honest, I'm a bit upset by that.
I thought you'd be pleased.
Well, oh, Dad, this is so horrible. This whole thing. We should have discussed this before.
I know, but we didn't. So we are where we are. Now, come on. What is it? What's eating you?
I don't want to sound ungrateful, Dad, but be honest with you. I mean, where's James been for the last 15 years? Where's Robert been for the last 15 years?
Well, they chose their own way, James. I mean, he is farming out in South Africa. Yeah. And Robert's done what he's done with his...
Yeah, he's sailing around the flipping world on his executive yacht.
Well, I know.
And who's been here? Who's the one? I mean, me and David, since the day before we were married. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry, Dad.
Sarah? Now look, Sarah, this is not like you, storming off like that. I mean, what else do you expect? We've always done. Your mother laid it down. You treat everybody the same. There are 3 of you. We split everything 3 ways. What could be fairer than that?
But, Dad, that's just the point. It isn't fair, is it? Huh?
I don't see what could be fairer.
Well, do you not see who has been here for 20 years? Who has been and worked there to the bone? Me and David have been here and we have worked ourselves to the bone.
You can say that, but for 4 generations, this farm has gone down from father to oldest son. And oldest son is James, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
And by right, some would say it ought to go to him.
Dad, it's the 21st century. That is totally unfair. OK, that is totally unfair.
Well, he is a farmer.
So? He's not farming here, is he? I'm the one that's put in the work. Me and my husband and my family. And what about my kids? What about Alex? He's 18. Doesn't know what to do with himself, does he? He doesn't know whether to go to agricultural college, or he doesn't know whether to follow his dream and go and do his art.
Well,
I mean, what am I supposed to say to him?
well, I think you should say go to agricultural college. I mean, there's always going to be room in the farm.
But Dad, if this goes 3 ways, I mean, how am I supposed to manage this? How am I going to do it? How's it going to work? What are we going to do? Build extra houses? I can't afford to buy them out.
Well,
James isn't going to want to come back. Robert certainly isn't. It's going to be me and David here, and our family.
well, maybe we could, like, split the farmhouse and, you know, because I can see you couldn't buy them out very
Curtain
easily.
down the middle. What are you supposed to do?
No,
You live in
don't be
one house and then
ridiculous.
live in
Don't be
another house. I'm
stupid.
not being ridiculous.
Yes, you are. You could. He could have half the value of the farmhouse, and Robert could have the other half of that, and that would go some way towards your being able to buy them out.
This is just a mess, Dad. This should have been sorted out years ago.
I know, but it wasn't. So what's the point of going backwards?
Well,
We didn't sort it out.
No, we didn't sort it out, and you know why?
Well, what would...
I'll tell you why, Dad.
Why?
It's because you have never, ever treated this as a business.
What?
This has never been treated as a business.
How do you think it survived all these years if I hadn't treated it like a business?
It's not. You don't know the difference, Dad, between family and business, and that is the
do you
trouble.
mean?
I'm sorry, I just can't.
It's
do
a
it.
family business. That's what it means.
Nonsense, Dad.
So just some hints and tips about planning for succession. And I should say, you know, all businesses are different, all families are different. So there's not a blueprint, but there's just some guidance really. Identify the business roles that need to be undertaken in the business on the farm. It's possible to delegate responsibility and decision-making authority, and to work out who is accountable for different aspects of the business. And like I said, succession is handing over managerial control. That can happen a bit at a time. Business meetings are really important to discuss this, not the way that Sarah and her father have been discussing it. And I would say, certainly for a while, working through the process of planning succession, these should be regularly scheduled, not on a holiday or someone's birthday or something like that. Somebody needs to take minutes, notes, actions, and then they need to be agreed by everybody involved. And it might be useful to hire a facilitator. So facilitators can take some of the heat out of the discussion. As we just saw, you know, it quite quickly gets really heated and really difficult. And they can say things to family members that if, you know, people in the family were saying it together, it might cause trouble. So it's worth thinking about hiring a facilitator. And if you want to even go further than having a succession plan, you can think about having a family business constitution. So that's just, it can be a very simple document, but it can say things like, you know, these are the goals of this business. This is what we're trying to achieve. Are we just going for, you know, growth, or do we want, you know, do we want a work-life balance? What are we trying to achieve? What are our values? What are the rules of behaviour? How do we meet with people? How do we engage? Is it enough just to share the family name, or do you need to bring something else into the business? And when we see the next slide, the key thing is the timing for this. And as I've said before, succession is a process. It's not an event that just takes place in one moment in time. It's a process that can happen over a period of years. It's never too soon to start planning, and it's really important that people aren't overtaken by events, as we're going to see in the next penultimate slide.
Sarah, yesterday when I was on the way back from the hospital, I was just thinking, you know, I think I've made a bit of a mess of things.
What do you mean, Dad?
Well, I was talking to Mike over at Cosford's, and he's, you know, he's in the same position as me. He doesn't know how long he's got, really. Probably less than me, if anything. But he says he's, for years now, he's been talking to, you know, like financial advisors and accountants, and he's got it all sorted out with, you know, as far as the money goes. Do you see what I mean?
Well, yeah, I mean...
Well, he says, and I should have thought about this years ago, he says that if you could put some things in place, and if you then live for 7 years, which I'm not going to do now, he you could like make tax easier for, you know, when I come to pass, you know, when you get the farm. It's not evasion, is that the word? But you can avoid tax if you did it with 7 years to go, he said. And there's all sorts of things like trust funds, and I could have done for your kids, and I was just too bloody busy, you know. I mean, there's always something to be done, isn't there? You know, there's the herd, there's the fencing, there's buying new land or not buying new land.
Dad,
and I haven't got round to it.
Are you saying you haven't done anything?
Well, about 10 years ago I did make a will. That was before your mother went, of course. She made me do it, but I didn't really go into any detail about what to do with the money.
Oh, Dad, this is such a mess. I mean...
It is a mess, love. And it's my fault.
Don't blame yourself,
You should have
Dad.
pushed me harder when you raised it first. I don't know what we... Well, I'll tell you what I have done. I've got round to asking... you know, Mike was able to recommend this fellow that's become the financial advisor, so I'm going to see him, but I think it may be too late, really.
The really important things are succession. It's so easy for people to put it off. As we've seen, it's emotionally fraught. There's lots of difficult situations, lots of difficult conversations, and it just gets put off. Don't let it get put off. It's important to have open and honest conversations. The three most important things about succession planning are communication, communication, communication. So succession has to be planned for. It doesn't just happen. Retirement has to be planned for. Whatever that retirement is, the older generation need to think about, what would I like retirement to look like? Where might I live? Where's my money going to come from? And it's important to involve family members in these discussions. You know, hopefully long gone are the days when, you know, basically the old man would decide what was going to happen and he would just do it. And, you know, actually those days aren't all gone, because that is what happens sometimes still. But it's important to involve people in the family in discussions about this. Not everybody might want the farm. There's some people that, you know, I've spoken to farmers who said, oh, you know, I have daughters, they don't want the farm. And then when they ask them, turns out they are interested in farming. And the final thing I'm going to say is seek professional assistance. So that's not, so I've mentioned about, you know, accountants, financial planning, legal assistance, and using a facilitator. Yes, it's all going to cost money, but the way I see it is it's an investment in the future of the farm, and importantly, the future of the family. Because if you get it wrong, it can take years and years to unravel and for the scars of succession to heal. So my key thing is keep talking and don't put it off. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Matt, for that. I think you'll all agree that was very thought-provoking. Next, we have Sean McCann. Sean is a financial planner and rural insurer and financial advice firm NFU Mutual. He has 25 years experience advising farmers and landowners on inheritance tax and pension planning. Sean has a wealth of expertise on maximising the available tax reliefs and avoiding any pitfalls. Sean's advice is often featured in national media, and he regularly presents at seminars on tax and pensions to farming groups. Over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Rosie. Good evening, everyone. As you already heard from Matt, it's the aim of a lot of farming families to pass the farm on to the next generation. So I'm happy to do this during their lifetime. I just want to hold on to it until the day they die. There isn't really a right time when it comes to passing on the farm, but the important thing is to plan it, because if you have a plan, it's likely to lead to a smoother transition and can go a long way to protecting the future of the farm. So could you have the next slide, please, Bennett? So there's four things I want to talk to you about this evening. The first is tax, because it doesn't really matter when you're handing the farm on. You don't really want to pay more tax than you need to. Secondly, we'll look at some options when it comes to planning and making provision for children who aren't interested in the farm, and some of the things you can do there. I'll tell you why you need a will. A will is vitally important to farming families. And I'll finish off just by giving you a few tips and ideas when it comes to making your own plan. Okay, so there's two taxes I'll talk to you about tonight. The first is inheritance tax, which in its most simple form is a tax on what you leave behind when you die. If you're giving assets away during your lifetime, you need to think about capital gains tax, because not only is that payable when you sell something that's worth more than you paid for it, but it can also be triggered when you give things away. So we'll talk about that as well. Let's look at inheritance tax first. So if we take an example of a single person who's never been married, when that person dies, normally the first £325,000 is free of inheritance tax. But after that, it's taxed at a flat, what you leave behind is taxed at a flat rate of 40 pence in the pound. So if that person left £1 million, their beneficiaries would have to find just over £250,000 in tax before the assets could be released. Now, if you leave, you can leave an unlimited amount to your spouse or civil partner. Could move the next slide on, please, Dan. So I could leave £10 million to my wife, and that would be completely exempt from inheritance tax. And when my wife dies, she could use my £325,000 tax-free and her own £325,000. So she'd get £650,000 tax-free. At £1 million, if we left £1 million, the children would only have to find £140,000. Now, there's another extra tax you can leave for against another allowance you can use against your main home, but I won't bore you with that tonight. But there's some really good news if you own farming assets, agricultural land or buildings. So next slide, please, Dan. A really generous relief called agricultural property relief. Now, if you're able to get this, it will be available at one of two rates, either 100% or 50%. If you get it at 100%, what that means is the agricultural value of the asset is exempt from inheritance tax. And if you get it at 50%, half the value is tax-free and the other half is taxable. So if you're a farmer and you own and occupy your own farm it yourself, and you've done so for more than 2 years before you die, the agricultural value of that land and those buildings that you're using for agricultural purposes should be exempt from inheritance tax. So next slide, Dan, please. Now, if you own agricultural land and buildings and you let them out to somebody else who's farming, provided you've owned that piece of land or that building for at least 7 years, and throughout that 7 years it's been farmed either by you or somebody else, and you have the right to vacant possession of the land within 24 months, or you've got a farm business tenancy on the land granted after the 1st of September 1995, you can also get 100% agricultural property relief. And it's this relief that's led to a lot of inflation in farmland prices. Because if I'm a very, very wealthy individual, why don't I go out and buy a big farm and put a farm manager in there, let him run it for me for 2 years, I'll suffer the profits and losses. After that 2 years, that land should be exempt from inheritance tax. The law stays the same. Or if I don't fancy suffering the profits and losses, what I could do is rent that land out on a farm business tenancy, and after 7 years, it'll be exempt from inheritance tax. So it's a really, really valuable relief for farmers. Next slide, please, Dan. Okay, you can also get agricultural property relief on your farmhouse as well. But there's a couple of hurdles you need to jump. And the first hurdle is you've got to be living in the farmhouse for agricultural purposes. You've got to actually be doing the farming. It's got to be the centre from which the day-to-day farming operation is run. So I'll give you an example that catches quite a lot of older farmers. is those that maybe haven't got a successor, what they do is they get to a certain age and decide they're going to let all their land out on a farm business tenancy and stay in the farmhouse. Now, if they die, while they still get agricultural property from the land and buildings that are let out for agricultural purposes, they won't get relief from the house because they're not doing the farming. They've let it out and somebody else is farming it. So there are ways and means around that, which I won't bore you with tonight, but suffice to say that's a trap to look out for those who decide to retire. Once you jump that hurdle, the second hurdle you've got to jump is the farmhouse has got to be of a character appropriate to the farming operation that's going on. So to give you an extreme example, we get lots of calls that say, I've just bought myself a lovely house in the country with a 5-acre paddock. I want to put some sheep on it. So can I claim agricultural property relief on my house because I'm doing some farming? And the answer to that question is no, you can't, because you don't need a house of that size to run 5 acres of sheep. So as long as that house has been the sort of house for that size of acreage for many years, there's normally not too much of a problem with getting relief from the house. But the revenue are starting to look much more closely at it, and they are starting to challenge more cases around the farmhouse. And we have seen a number that have been challenged recently, where they were once a farmhouse for a much bigger farm, and over the years blocks of land have been sold off, and now it's a particularly grand house or a relatively small acreage. So we do see them challenged. Okay, next slide please, Dan. Now, also more good news as well is that you can also get tax relief on your live and dead stock on your farm. So your tractors, all your machinery, etc. As long as you've owned them for at least 2 years when you die, you should get 100% business property relief. So that should be exempt from inheritance tax as well. Now, it's important to point out as well, a lot of farms have diversified over recent years, and some of them have moved away from sort of trading activities and have diversified into investment businesses. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that my business was, let's say I own 10 buy-to-let properties, and I let all those properties out. I spend all my time going around maintaining them, picking up rents, negotiating tenancies. I view that as my business and those houses as my business assets. But the revenue would not give me any business property relief from them because they would deem them to be investment assets, to be an investment business. And you don't get any business property relief on investment businesses. But where some farmers can get caught is where they've diversified in a really big way. So they've gone into holiday lets, or they've been letting some of their land out for solar panels or wind turbines or all sorts of other things. Is that it is possible to get relief on some of those assets if they are included in one business. But it can be quite a complex area. So if you have diversified in any way, it's important to get some advice to make sure you don't fall foul of the rules. One case I saw very, very recently is a farmer whose 2 children had set up a farm shop in one of his barns. And he unfortunately died. But when they tried to claim business property relief on the barn that he owned, the revenue said no, because they said, although that was his barn and it was being used for business, it wasn't his business. So his son and daughter had set up the farm shop and they were trading as a partnership independently of him. So therefore, he lost all relief. So the family had to pay inheritance tax on that particular asset. Okay, next slide, please, Ben. Now, this is one to look out for as well, is that business property relief is limited to 50% on assets, business assets that you hold outside the partnership agreement. Sorry, outside the partnership. So let me give you an example. So let's say I'm a sole trader and I decide to go into partnership with my son. Let's say, I don't know, I own a garage. I own the garage building, I own all the kit in the garage, all the tools, all the equipment. I decided to go into partnership with my son. But because I'm a bit worried about my son and his sort of financial stability, I decided to keep the garage building outside our partnership. Because I don't want, if he gets into trouble, I don't want my assets or the assets of the partnership being at risk. So what that will mean is that if I die, I will only get 50% business property relief on the value of that building because it's held outside our partnership. Again, there's ways and means to get around this, but it's important to get some advice. Okay, next slide, please. Now, it's also really important to look out for situations if you've got development potential on any of your land and buildings. Because let's say you've got a piece of land that's got potential for building on it. We all know the value goes up to the roof. So let's say the agricultural value of that land is, say, £8,000 an acre. But for building potential, let's say it's £250,000 an acre. Now, if I'm still farming that piece of land when I die, I should get agricultural property relief on the 8,000, the agricultural value, and business property relief on the enhanced development value. But if I decide to let that piece of land out, so I'm not farming it, I'm just picking up a rent. If I die, I'll get agricultural property relief on the £8,000 agricultural value, but no relief at all on the £250,000 development potential. So my family would have to pay inheritance tax on that extra £250,000. And the other thing to look out for, I talk to a lot of our customers, and we talk about their assets, their land, their buildings, and we often talk about building potential. And a lot of farmers say, well, if I don't apply for planning permission, the revenue can't argue it's got a high development value. But unfortunately, the revenue have this concept called hope value. And the way hope value works is they will look at the market value of that piece of land or that building and determine what it was fetched on the open market. And the developer was interested enough in it, in buying it in the hope they might get business planning permission on it. It's like the revenue would like to put the same value on it. So it's one to look out for. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of the traps, a few things to look out for that I've seen people fall foul of. So one example is the revenue can claw back agricultural and business property relief. So I'll give an example of what I mean. So let's say I've got a farm worth £2 million and I decide to give it to my son today. And my son farms it for 3 years and he decides at that point he's had enough and he sells it. And then I die within 7 years of having given it to him. Now my son has turned that farm that qualified for agricultural property relief into a pile of money that doesn't qualify for the relief. So the revenue would look at that and see what I'd given away in 7 years before I died and claw it back in. Now my son's no longer farming it, he's turned it into a pile of money. My estate will pay inheritance tax on the full value. So it's one to look out for. We've talked about the dangers of the retired farmer staying on in the farmhouse. So that can lead to loss of agricultural property on the farmhouse. We've also talked a bit about diversification, about if you've got a diversified farm, it's worthwhile taking some advice to make sure you're not endangering any of the lives. And the final trap to look out for here as well is if you're going into partnership, because partnerships are a great way of bringing the next generation in, because you don't have to hand over all the assets or whatever. You can give the younger generation a share in the business. But it's really important to check partnership agreements, because lurking in some of these older partnership agreements is what they call a right to buy clause. And what that means is let's say Rosie and I were farming together in partnership. If I were to die, Rosie would have to buy my share of the business from my spouse, my wife, and my wife would have to sell. and that's deemed to be what we call a binding contract. So what that means is I would lose all agricultural and business property relief. So my value of the farm would be fully taxable. And what we could do instead is change that clause. So it's called what's called an option clause. And what that means is if I die, Rosie has the option to buy my share of the farm. And if she decides to exercise that, my wife and children would have to agree to sell to her. But because it's an option, that preserves the reliefs. So the last one of these I saw was in a partnership agreement of two farming brothers who came to Stratford to see us. It must be about 2 or 3 years ago now. They hadn't looked at their partnership agreement since 1986 when their father died. And in there was lurking one of these clauses. And that farm was worth about £3 million. So had either of them died, that would have meant their share of the farm was completely subject to inheritance tax. So we told them to go and see the solicitor the next morning, get that changed, and obviously drive home very, very carefully. Okay, next slide, please, now. Okay, so that's how inheritance tax works with farms. If the older generation is giving assets away during their lifetime, the other thing to look out for is capital gains tax. So it can be triggered not just when you sell something, but it can also be triggered when you give things away. Now, the important thing about inheritance tax is it's washed away on death. So if I bought a farm, let's say, I don't know, 30 years ago for £100,000, and today it's worth £1 million, and I die, if my children sell it the day after my death, it should be free of inheritance tax, but importantly, it'll be free of capital gains tax as well. Because the gain that I had, the difference between 100,000 I paid for it and £1 million today, the 900,000 is completely washed away on my death with no capital gains tax. And that can be quite useful if you've got land with planning potential and things, just to be aware of that particular aspect of capital gains tax. Okay, next slide, please, Dan. Now, the good news is as well is that if you're handing over agricultural land or buildings or other qualifying business assets, is you can claim what's called holdover relief. And what that means is you don't pay any capital gains tax at that point. So I'll give you an example. This farm that I bought 30 years ago for 100,000, it's worth £1 million today. I'll give it to my children. We won't pay any capital gains tax at that point because we'll claim holdover relief. But if my children sell it, let's say 5 years later, and it's grown to 1.1 million, they will pay capital gains tax on the £1 million, i.e. the difference between 1.1 it's worth in 5 years' time and the 100,000 I paid for it. So it's one to look out for. Okay, Dan, next one, please. Okay, so when it comes to making the plan, I think it's really echoing some of the thoughts that Matt gave us. I think it's really important to involve the whole family. We see countless situations where mum and dad make the plans, go away themselves and don't tell anybody about them. And, that, to me, that isn't the most effective way. I think it's really important to involve everyone. Those that are involved in the farm, those that aren't involved in the farm, all need to be party to those discussions. Matt also talked about, whether it should be equal or unequal shares. I mean, obviously there is a desire to be fair to everyone in the family, all the children, but fair doesn't necessarily have to mean equal. And also really important is that wills and agreements reflect what the desires of the family are, because they might make some great agreements between themselves, but if it isn't set out properly in the wills and agreements, that can cause some big problems. So next slide, please. So when it comes to making provision for non-farming children, there are countless options. And just take you through a few of these. Now, one option that could be looked at, it's not by any means the most popular, is that all the children could inherit part of the freehold. and the non-farming children would take a rate from that. And that is really trying to think about the farm, think about the ownership and the management of the farm as two separate issues. You know, because one or two children take over the management, it isn't necessarily the case they have to have all the assets on day one. You know, the older generation could gradually pass over more and more of the assets over time. Obviously, another simple solution is to gift non-farming property, which is, you know, obviously not an option everyone has, I appreciate, but it is one to be looked at. Alternatively, build up funds outside the farm. There's a number of things we look at with our customers on this topic. So one very, very simple way is to take out what's called a whole of life insurance. Now that policy, the older generation takes it out on their life, and it will pay out one day. Whether they die at 85 or 105, we know we're paying that money out. And that policy could be written in trust for the non-farming children, so that when the older generation passes on, that money, the sum assured of that policy, pays out free of inheritance tax to the non-farming children to compensate them for not getting a share of the farm. The other way a lot of people do this, we've got lots of customers who continue paying into pensions, lots of farming customers, with absolutely no intention of ever taking the money. Dan, just the next slide, please. And the reason for that is whatever money you leave in your pension fund when you die can normally be left completely free of inheritance tax. And HMRC, the taxman, will help you build up these funds as well. So next slide, please, Dan. So basically you get tax relief. So for every £80 you pay into a pension, the government will add another £20 on top. And if you're paying higher rate tax at 40%, you can claim up to another £20 back from your tax return. And 45% taxpayers can claim another £25 back. So it's a very tax efficient way of building up funds in order to leave them to the next generation. Okay, next slide, please, Dan. Also, while we're talking about pensions, we have a common situation, lots of our customers, where the older generation is very asset rich, but cash poor, and they want money either to go off and enjoy some of their own retirement, or more often they want to take money out to give to non-farming children, whether that's to buy a house or set them up in their own business or whatever. So the younger generation, we encourage farmers to start their pension planning early because they can build up the fund. So if we say, the younger generation gets to say 35 and they've built up a pension fund, that pension fund can be transferred into what you call a self-invested pension. And that self-invested pension can buy farmland. And in this example, we've used the younger generation put money into a self-invested pension that buys it off their parents. So the land goes into their pension fund and they pay a rent to the pension fund to occupy. And again, that's a very tax efficient way to occupy land because the pension fund doesn't pay any income tax on the rent. Now, the only thing to watch out for this is that the older generation, if they're selling land, could face capital gains tax. So we would look at that to make sure that it's done in tranches so we don't trigger a capital gains tax bill. So it can be done over a number of years. So the pension fund as well can borrow money. And a number of pension funds can come together. So if there are two children in the younger generation who own pension funds, both their pension funds could buy a piece of land together. So it's quite a flexible arrangement. Okay, next slide, please, man. Okay, and I said I was going to tell you why you need a will. It's really for the simple reason that if you don't make a will, the law decides what happens. So if I'm a farmer and I've got 3 children, one of whom is farming, and I don't make a will, then that farm is going to be split 3 ways. So, it'd be if the farming child wanted to carry on farming, they'd have to buy out their siblings. If that isn't what you want, then you need to make a will. Because I'm sure we've all seen cases where farming families have fallen out, there's been disputes, and ultimately the for sale sign has gone up outside the farm purely for the want of a will. And it's really important that's reviewed regularly as well to make sure it stays up to date. Okay, next slide, please. Now, there is a way that you can use your will to wash the same asset through the system twice to potentially get 2 lots of relief. Now, I've used quite an extreme example here just to demonstrate a point, just to show you how it works. So let's say we've got a farmer, Mr. Black, and he's got farmland worth £2 million. And he's been farming it for many years, so it should be free of inheritance tax. Now, also, remarkably, he's got £2 million in cash and investments. What he could do is leave the farmland to his children. That would be because he's been farming it for more than 2 years. He should get 100% relief. It should be free of inheritance tax to the kids. And he leaves the other £2 million to his wife. And because it's his wife, there's no limit on the amount of money or investments he can leave her free of inheritance tax. Next slide, please, Dan. But then his widow uses the cash he's left her to buy the farmland back off the children. So she's got the farmland back and the children have got the cash. And remember, capital gains tax was washed away on her husband's death. So there shouldn't be any capital gains tax to pay either. Now, Mrs. Black, as long as she farms that land for at least 2 years, she should get 100% of cultural property relief as well. So when she dies, the children get the land back completely free of inheritance tax. Now, there's nothing illegal about that. It's perfectly legitimate. All you're doing is just washing the same asset through the system twice. Okay, next slide, please, Dan. So, sort of finally, really, I think when you're making a plan, there's some key things to look at. Firstly, who owns the assets? Because often when I walk onto a farm and say, okay, well, who owns what? And you'll say, well, we own everything. And then you find a real patchwork where dad owns some land, mum owns some land, mum and dad own some land together, dad owns some with his brother. It's a whole patchwork of ownership. And also who's occupying on what basis, what businesses are actually being run on the farm. What's the longer term direction of the business? Where's it going? What's the plan? And what role will each family member play now and in the future? And what experience or qualifications or training will younger members need to be able to take on some of these roles? Okay, next slide, please. So just to finish off, really, I think the 4 things I'd say are around making a plan is plan early, because the earlier you plan, the more options you've got. Maximise the tax breaks. They're very generous, but they're quite easy to lose. There are some traps out there for the unwary. Involve the whole family. I think that's absolutely critical. And importantly, take advice. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Lots of information to take in there. Just a reminder to everyone listening that if you have got any questions, to put them in the chat box before Matt finishes. So finally, we have our very own county chairman, Mr. Matt Darke. Matt is a mixed farmer, or 4th generation mixed farmer from Kingsbridge, and I'll leave it over to you. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Rosie. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So as introduced, my name is Matt Darke. I think my role for this evening is to give a bit of a personal perspective on a scenario that we've ended up with and how we've tried to overcome it / overcoming it. So yeah, let's first of all start by saying what an honor it is to be speaking with on this structure this evening. The succession and progression side of a business is something I've been involved with it quite a bit. We've done a talk in the past with young farmers at the Devon County Show on succession and progression. And it's something that's really close to myself and the family and how things progress forward. So basically, I'm the 4th generation of our farm at Coleridge, which is in South Devon. The farm was taken over by my great-grandfather back in the 1960s. And then it ended up with 2 of his 3 sons carrying on and progressing the farm forward. So it originally started out with 300 acres, and then over the years to come, we've managed to accumulate up to 750 acres here. We're, like Rosie said, a mixed enterprise, jack of all trades, master of none. We've got dairy, sheep, beef, and arable. So that's pretty much the farm that we're on. So basically, I'll just give a bit of a structure of how the family tree worked. So like I say, my great-grandfather, he took the farm over back in the 1960s. 2 of his sons came into the farm. Then with the laws of nature, they each had 3 children each, with only 2 of my grandfather's children wanting to stay into the business. So that leaves my father and my uncle. So up until about 6 years ago, we had my grandfather and his brother, my uncle and my father in the business. And then about 5 years ago, unfortunately, my great uncle had he had a stroke, which was devastating. But unfortunately, it meant that he couldn't work on the farm, but still stayed involved with everything that we were doing as much as he could. So that's kind of the basis of where the farm is. My great-grandfather, he had the best intentions, really, of leaving shares to all of his grandchildren, which a lot of people kind of advised him not to do, but he wanted to keep a lot of people involved, or try and keep all of his family involved with the business. So basically, we ended up with 6 of, so the same generation as my father, with shares in the business. We've only 2 of those 6 still having any sort of involvement. So that's how the family tree has worked. So we've, like I say, the dairy side of the business is one of the biggest parts that we've got. We've always milked around 200 cows. We have then had 600 ewes up to now. We've got 300 acres of arable. We've got about 150 cattle finished a year, up to maybe 200, something like that. So we've got, like I say, a mixed bag. But then when my uncle, he had his accident about 6 years ago, he's then decided he wanted to retire. So he then has said that he wants to leave, which was fair enough. But like I say, we've got to try and narrow this family tree from 6 of that generation down to what is just now my father and my brother and myself. So after a lot of talks and things like that, it became quite messy because there wasn't a lot of planning. There wasn't really any idea of how a retirement was going to happen of this sort of nature, how we were going to try and deal with everybody that was so involved with this business, like still had little shares of the business. So when my father, my great uncle had his accident, we shifted the business forward to cater for that accident with the robot, moving from an old Tribo Impala to robots to cater for that accident. And then we then had to deal with moving forward with the business in that sort of way. And then when he started to bring up a new area of retiring, it then caused another thing of how we're going to try and move the business forward without crippling it, as effect. Like I said, there's been no planning. There's no sort of how we're going to deal with it. And when this popped up, to be quite honest, it was a frightening time. There was lots of talks of how many acres are we going to sell and how much of the farm we're going to have left, how we're going to deal with it, even to the point of, well, if we've got half the farm, have we got to, are we all going to be able to work here, and all the things like that. So that was like the early stages of the planning and of the talks of it. And then it started getting down to, let's think of how we can move the business forward to try and cater for this. So like I say, we're milking the 250 cows, and we come to the business kind of answer then that we were going to up the dairy herd. So we were already talking of trying to pay out a significant sum to my great uncle and his children, to try and just narrow the interest in the farm down to my father and my brother and myself. But then we had to try and come up with how we can pay out the other side of the family and still keep the business running. And when you start going to the banks and things like that, because like it's been said, these like agricultural businesses can be very asset rich and cash poor. So when you go to the banks and because you've got to come up with this money, you're saying, right, I would like to borrow X amount of money to make a settlement, but then I want to borrow another, say, $500,000 or something to take forward the dairy side of the business to try and generate the money. And that's when eyebrows start raising, and they're like, well, hang on a minute, you're trying to borrow a lot and trying to work out what you're trying to borrow a lot and trying to do a lot at once. But then by the time we got our heads together, really worked out where we wanted to go forward and how we're going to do it, put the business plans together, we then come up with a settlement and things like that. And once we come to that settlement, it's a huge weight off your shoulders. So like we went from the stage of how many acres of the farm are we going to sell and what we're going to end up with, to right, let's work out what we can do to try and make these settlements and things like that. And now we are in the position where we've sold the robots after 6 years, and we've put in a rotary parlour that we're going to hopefully increase the cows up to 400 from 250. So basically, it's at the stage we're at now, it's a huge weight off our shoulders, because we've gone through what should have been a lot of planning over the last, say, 20 years. We've done a lot of planning and sorting out and settling in the last 5 years. So the whole process has happened very quickly, in the worrying through to, right, this is what we've done and this is how we've got to do it, to this is how we're going to try and make sure this farm carries on in the way of being a business, and being able to sustain the people that are still involved with the farm. But like our situation is such a usual trend amongst other businesses as well, and other farms, where you have a family tree getting bigger with so many people getting involved, like being born into the family, being born into the business, and potentially having a share of a business. And it's just how you can try and narrow down all of the people that are born into the family, trying to narrow it down to the people that are still active in the business and want to still continue with the farm, taking it forward and making sure it continues, because these things, you can end up with such arguments over who's entitled to what and who should be having what, and everybody thinks they should have the same amount. And so like this evening has shown, there can be such hard conversations to have of how who should get what, and how you're going to do it. So like like I've explained, we've tried to pay off everybody within the business and try and narrow it all down to who is actually functioning, which is now my father, my brother, and myself, and hopefully we've narrowed it all down that my children and my brother's children who want to be active in the farm have got a more straightforward view of what's going to happen. But then the thing about, we've done this settlement over the last 5 years, but we've got to make sure that we've got it all tied up to how we want it to progress from us. Because although we've narrowed it down to just say my brother and myself at the bottom, who are active in the farm, we've got to make sure that we set it up in the future to how we want the business to carry on. That's so hopefully we'll have children that are going to be as passionate as we are and want to carry the family farm forward. So we need to make sure that we've got it all kind of on paper of who's going to take on what, and how we're going to try and make it as fair as possible to all of our children and people to come in. So that's pretty much how we've done it and what we've done. I'm hoping that it's given a little bit of an insight into a personal perspective of what is happening out there on some people's farms, or our farm then, and how we've tried to overcome what's been such a really, well, it's been a really stressful time with arguments between families and putting strain on the family tree. But it just goes to show that if you can try and sort these things and have plans for these on an early doors, you can try and prevent arguments and make sure everybody's still on an even keel and everyone's on the same page. So I hope this has been of some information to you and of some help. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for sharing your story with us. We are getting short of time, so I am going to only ask a couple of questions, which I think the audience will find beneficial. So my first question is directed at Sean, and it is, what happens with inheritance tax where there are two farmhouses on the farm, one being lived in by the parents and then the others being lived in by the son and the manager and the current farmers?
Okay, so it is possible to get agricultural property relief on more than one farmhouse, but it does depend on the situation. So as I said, the first hurdle you need to jump is that the people living in those properties need to be farming. So as an example, if I was a farmer living in house A and my son lived in house B on the farm, but he had nothing to do with the farm, he wasn't an employee, he wasn't a partner, he might just give me some occasional weather, we would not get relief on his property. So that's the first hurdle you've got to jump. People living in those properties have to be involved in the farm, either as a partner or as an employee. The second hurdle you need to jump as well is proving that you need two farmhouses on that farm. So as an example, if you have quite a mixed enterprise, if you have one sort of dairy unit on the farm and another, I don't know, make it up, an arable unit as well, it might be possible to prove that you need two houses to run that farming enterprise properly. So I suppose the simple answer is it depends on the circumstances, but it is certainly possible. But what I'd say is it's probably worthwhile getting some advice just on your own particular situation.
Thank you, Sean. The next question I think I will direct at Matt Lobley, that is. Sorry. Matt said about in his presentation planning early. how many years would you say it takes to complete a succession handover, and are there any specific stages needed?
Yeah, that's a good that's a good question. There isn't any set amount of time. I mean, it'll vary for different businesses and different families, but it's about having enough time. So some of the stuff, in fact, that Sean was talking about, if there's a need to particularly to make investments and stuff like that in order to build up assets, maybe for non-succeeding heirs, so you need to start early for that. But I guess you need enough time to, I mean, first of all, identify your successor, and that might not be necessarily straightforward. Then that successor needs to start working in the business and gradually get more and more decision-making responsibility, because farmers need to set their successors up so that they will be successful. And you get to be successful by learning the ropes and going through it. So typically we find, successors will, maybe some of the early decisions they get involved in is around, day-to-day working practices, how you hang a gate, deciding how much fertilizer to apply, stuff like that. And you gradually move up this kind of ladder of decision making. So there's those kind of short-term, day-to-day working decisions. Then there's longer-term decisions, a bit like some of the stuff that Matt was talking about thinking about kind of balance between enterprises, different sizes of enterprises, which bit are you going to grow, which bit is maybe going to stay as it is. So you need to get experience with making those kind of decisions and being involved in planning that. And then finally, there's a whole load of decisions around money. Who's got the checkbook? I discovered very early on in my career interviewing farmers. I remember interviewing this guy in his late 50s, and I'd asked him a question about, finances in the business, and he said, "Oh, I can't tell you." And I said, "Well, that's all right. You don't have to say anything. You can skip any question." And he said, "No, it's not that I can't. Don't want to. I can't." And he pointed to his dad, who was snoozing in the chair, who was in his 70s, and he said, "Dad has the checkbook. I've never seen any of the accounts. I don't know what's going on." And so those last, but really, really important areas of decision making around finance, it's often that's the last bit, that people don't want to let go of it, and then that creates problems when, if suddenly something happens, you suddenly find yourself assuming some responsibility for the business. If you don't have that experience of dealing with the financial aspects of decision making, that can be really difficult. So that's a long answer. There is no fixed period, but it does need a really good period of years to build up that experience for the successor to decide that it really is what she wants to be doing. Because some people might find partway through, what, I'd rather not work 80 hours a week for not very much money. I might go and do something else. So you need that kind of period for people to decide that it really is what they want to do and commit themselves to it. That's the end.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Matt. And finally, I think I'm going to direct the question at all three of you. And this will be the last question for the evening. If there was one piece of advice to a farming family who haven't done any succession planning, what would it be?
My advice would be do some succession planning. Start having those conversations.
I think as far as we're like, our personal experience would say is basically just get involved with the business as early as you can, and just have the conversations right at the beginning of just starting off small with getting involved with management decisions, just saying like breeds of animals that you want to keep, or just small decisions to start with, and just gradually work your way into it, instead of just being, say, the farm hand all the way through, and then just saying, right, I want to have the conversation. When am I going to take it on and become the checkbook owner, and when am I going to have it all handed over to me? I think it's just a gradual process of working your way in from an early age and increasing your involvement with the business, up to hopefully taking on the financial side before too long.
Yeah, I think probably two pieces of advice I give regularly is, first would be to definitely involve the whole family, because I've seen situations where mum and dad make these plans by themselves, don't make lots of assumptions about what their children want and don't want, and then don't share the plans with them, and the children are absolutely none the wiser. I'd also say think about some of the what ifs as well. So Matt, some of the things you've shared about your family, just think about, what could possibly happen, what could go wrong, and build those into your plans as well.
Thank you very much. So that is all the time we have for this evening. So I'm just going to do a few thank yous. Firstly, I'd like to thank Phoebe Ridley from NFU Mutual and Core Communications for helping Devon Young Farmers and NFU Mutual bring this evening together. I think everyone listening, including myself, will agree it's been really informative and I've learned a lot. And I'd like to thank the speakers this evening, giving up their time, creating their presentations and speaking for us this evening. And we do have quite a few questions, which I'm sure I will pass on to the speakers for their input. And then that finally leaves me time to thank you, the audience, for your participation and your questions. And I wish you all a good rest of your evening. Thank you.